welcome back to the History of Bosnia and Herzegovina podcast. I'm your host, Haris Porcic, and this is episode 6. Today, we will explore the story of the Bosnian Church, its origins, beliefs, organization, role in society, and its fate. This was a Christian church unique to Bosnia during the medieval period, known to its followers as Crkva Bosanska. The nature of the organization has been the subject of much debate. In the past, some scholars linked it to the dualist Bogomils, a notion that modern scholars now reject. In this episode, I will argue that it was simply an offshoot of the Catholic Church, where its adherents call themselves Kristjani, meaning Christians, or Dobri Bošnjani, meaning good Bosnians. This independent church produced few writings of its own, so we must rely on outside sources, which we now understand are not always objective. Despite this, we can piece together a comprehensive narrative of a church that stood apart from both Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox authority for centuries. Before we dive into the chronology, it's crucial to establish the context. Theological doctrine was not a central concern for medieval Bosnians. As historian John Fine noted, religion in Bosnia during this period was practiced in a very pragmatic way. Even clergy often had only a shallow understanding of Catholic doctrine. People universally considered themselves Christians in Bosnia, but their faith did not mean strict obedience to every rule from Rome. Bosnia's entire religious history took place in a predominantly rural society, which shaped how religion was practiced. Bosnia lacked large urban centers where formal theology might flourish. Instead, peasant life and traditional customs dominated. Medieval Bosnians intertwined religious practice with folk traditions. The peasants combined ancestral Slavic pagan customs with Christian rituals. For example, Bosnians celebrated the Slava, a patron saint's feast, like their Orthodox neighbors. They also engaged in what the church would deem magic or superstition, using amulets with prayers for health or fertility, casting spells for protection or cursing enemies, and believing in folk creatures like vile, meaning fairies in Bosnian. They also believed in demons, werewolves, and vampires. As a reminder, the concept of vampires originated in Southeast Europe. To the Bosnian peasant, there was no sharp divide between these folk practices and Christianity. Performing the rituals that kept one's family, crops, and livestock safe was what mattered, not theological purity. As one scholar put it, the typical Bosnian villager sees no need to understand why a ritual works, only that it does work. This pragmatic mindset meant that strict dualist theology found little ground among ordinary people. Dualism, the belief in two opposing divine forces of good and evil, was the hallmark of the Bogomils, but in Bosnia, most people were too focused on day-to-day survival to fixate on otherworldly doctrines. In fact, much of what medieval churchmen labeled heresy in Bosnia were likely just remnants of pre-Christian folk customs. The average Bosnian was a peasant first and a member of any church second, concerned more with the practical help than with fine points of theology. Even Bosnia's nobility was remarkably casual about religion compared to elsewhere in Europe. Bosnian nobles did not tie their political loyalty or salvation to one denomination. They would change religious affiliation if political circumstances required it, and they rarely interfered with their subjects' faiths. Religion was not a major factor in Bosnia's internal politics, but rather a tool used by foreign powers to justify interference in the country. Another important aspect of Bosnian religious life was the scarcity of church infrastructure and clergy in remote areas. Contemporary travelers in the 13th century noted the absence of churches in many villages. Services might be held in a field or a private home when a priest happened to visit. It was rare for a village to see a priest more than a few times a year. More importantly, Most priests themselves were local peasants who were semi-literate at best, performing priestly duties only on special occasions. Regular Sunday Mass was not common across the land. Christian rites were largely confined to baptisms, funerals, and annual feasts. In summary, organized religion had minimal influence in the countryside of medieval Bosnia. This weak institutional presence would later make it easier for people to convert to Islam under the Ottomans, because for many, conversion simply meant adopting a few new practices while maintaining their old worldview. To illustrate this continuity of mindset, even long after people converted to Islam, many former Christians retained folk customs that blended faiths. There are accounts from the 19th century of Bosnian Muslims praying before icons of the Virgin Mary when ill, or asking Catholic priests to baptize their children for good luck. Muslim girls might wear crosses and visit Christian monasteries for holy water blessings. Such stories show that for Bosnians, religion was often a matter of communal tradition and personal benefit. In his book, The Bosnian Church, A New Interpretation, historian John Fine writes that when Bosnian peasants adopted a new religion, they, quote, accepted a few obvious and formal new practices, but basically continued to live and believe as they always had, end quote. This understanding is crucial as we examine a community that evolved in this very unorthodox environment. With this context in mind, we can better understand how the Bosnian Church emerged and why it took the shape it did. Now, let's turn to the origins and early history of this church in the late 12th and early 13th centuries. As I discussed in previous episodes, Christianity reached Bosnia before the migration of Slavs. We have evidence of churches by the 6th century. By the 12th century, Bosnia was nominally Catholic. It was under the Hungarian crown and had its own native Catholic bishop, under the Archbishop of Dubrovnik. By 1192, due to Hungarian political influence, the bishopric was moved from the authority of Dubrovnik to Split. The previous episode goes into full detail about the implications and results of this move, but to summarize, the Bosnian Ban Kulin essentially ignored the change and continued his relationship with Dubrovnik. To retaliate, the Archbishop of Split began stirring up accusations of heresy that eventually led to the events in 1203 at Bilinopolje, where Kulin and the Bosnian clergy swore allegiance to Rome, renouncing their errors. The monks also promised to wear distinct clothing to distinguish themselves from the common man and promised to no longer call themselves Kristjani, but brothers, as was the common title for Catholic monks. Crucially, no one was punished or executed at Bilinopolje. There were no burnings of heretics and no detailed recanting of dualist theology, as happened in other heresy trials in Europe. This indicates that the church officials present did not view the Bosnian clergy as deliberate heretics at all, but rather as ignorant or slightly divergent Catholics. The errors renounced seem to have been matters of discipline and church organization, not fundamental doctrine. If the Bosnians had been dualists, we would expect explicit condemnations of beliefs, like rejecting the cross or the Trinity, but nothing of the sort is recorded. Later writers would agree that the 1203 renunciation shows a Catholic monastic community correcting its practices, not a Bogomils sect being converted. About 20 years later, we again see rumblings of heresy. At this time, we have a new Ban named Matej Ninoslav, who was a grandnephew or a distant relative of Ban Kulin. The Pope wrote to the Archbishop of Kalocha in Hungary to investigate a Bosnian bishop for ignorance and defending heretics. And in 1233, he declared that the bishop be removed from office for incompetence. The investigation turned up no heretical practices among the Bosnians. We will see this pattern repeat over the upcoming years. many accusations, no evidence of heresy. Ninoslav professed his Catholic faith to the Pope and promised to persecute the heretics. However, at the end of 1233, the Pope appointed a foreigner as the new Bishop of Bosnia, John of Wildeshausen. This bishop was a Dominican friar who wanted nothing to do with Bosnia, and as far as we can tell, never stepped foot inside the country. This appointment displeased the locals, Ninoslav included. The stage was set for conflict. A Bosnian Bon who had been born and raised in the local church versus a foreign hierarchy backed by Hungary. By late 1234, Pope Gregory IX was dissatisfied with Bosnia's progress in rooting out heresy, perhaps due to inactivity by Ninoslav, and proclaimed a crusade against the heretics in October of that year. This crusade effectively gave Hungary a license to invade Bosnia under the cloak of religion. Hungarian forces, led by the king's brother, Prince Koloman, attacked in 1235. Unfortunately, details of the battles are scarce. We do not know exactly where the fighting took place or how brutal it was. We do know that the Pope appointed another new bishop of Bosnia, a Dominican named Ponsa, in 1238, while declaring that Ban Ninoslav had fallen back into heresy for presumably refusing to accept the foreign bishop. This crusade was much political as it was religious. The loyal Catholic Dubrovnik continued to treat Ninoslav as an ally throughout the 1230s, which would be unthinkable if he were truly a heretic. Indeed, modern historians view the crusade of the 1230s as a cover for Hungarian attempts to conquer and administer Bosnia. Any gains the Hungarian crusaders made were short-lived. By 1241, the Hungarian army had to withdraw from Bosnia due to the Mongol invasion of their lands. The immediate effect of the crusade, however, was a deepening resentment of Hungarian meddling and a widening rift between Bosnia and the Roman Catholic Church. After the Hungarians placated the Mongols, the papacy made one more administrative change to the church organization. In 1246, Pope Innocent IV officially placed the Bosnian bishopric under the authority of the Archbishop of Kalocha in Hungary. Then, in 1252, the Bosnian Catholic bishop's seat was moved out of Bosnia altogether to the town of Đakovo in Slavonia, modern-day Croatia. From 1252 onward, the Bishop of Bosnia resided in Hungarian-held territory north of the Sava River. In practice, this meant that inside of Bosnia there was no resident Catholic bishop. From 1252 until the end of the Middle Ages, only 2 bishops even visited the country. They had virtually no influence on the ground. The local clergy were left to their own ways. It is in this absence of Catholic authority that we see the Bosnian Church emerge as a truly independent entity. Essentially, the Bosnian Church was the same community of native Bosnian clergy that had existed all along, but now they were cut off from Rome's hierarchy and went their own way. The only real change from 1203 was the relationship to Rome. The Bosnian Church, once nominally under the Pope, now operated independently due to the absence of Rome's appointed bishops. This separation was in large part a reaction against outside domination. Political leaders were threatened by Hungarian aggression, and Bosnian religious leaders felt imposed upon by foreigners. Together, they had motivation to preserve local customs and autonomy, almost in defiance of Hungary and Rome. In other words, Bosnians clung to their own way of worship as a point of national and cultural pride. Importantly, this Bosnian church likely continued most of the same Christian practices as before. It did not suddenly embrace dualist theology. It simply lacked a pope's oversight. We find evidence that neighboring powers sometimes viewed it as essentially Christian. For example, a Serbian charter issued between 1305 and 1307 by King Stefan Uroš lists Djed Miroslav, a leader of the Bosnian Church, among the witnesses alongside Orthodox and Catholic clergy. The Serbian Orthodox Church generally condemned Bogomils as heretics, so it's telling that a Bosnian church elder was invited to witness a royal document, something highly unlikely if he were considered a Bogomil. This incident suggests that in practice the Bosnian Church was regarded, at least by some contemporaries, as another Christian order, not radically different from the Catholics and Orthodox. So, by the mid-13th century, the Bosnian Church had taken shape, a self-governing Christian community in Bosnia led by its own hierarchy. The head of the church was called the Djed, meaning grandfather, analogous to a bishop. Next in rank was the Gost, translating to guest, and below them the Starac, translating to elder. These titles, unique to Bosnia, hinted a monastic character. Indeed, the Bosnian Church appears to have been mostly monastic church, where its leaders and members were monks living in monasteries called hije, meaning houses. The hije were not grand monasteries like in Western Europe. They were more like simple communal homes where monks lived. Not only did these hije serve religious purposes, they also doubled as places for travelers, especially merchants from Dubrovnik, who found lodging in them while traveling through Bosnia. The ordination practices and lifestyle also mirrored Catholic monasticism. The evidence suggests Bosnian church clergy were celibate, unlike Bogomil leaders who often married. In essence, they were Catholic monks who rejected the Pope's authority and used the Slavonic language and local customs. In the early 14th century, Bosnia entered a period of expansion under the Kotromanić dynasty. Ban Stjepan II ruled the Banat of Bosnia from 1322 to 1353. By his time, Bosnia had been effectively out of contact with official Catholic structures for roughly 70 years. Stjepan himself was raised by his mother, a Serbian princess, and was probably Orthodox Christian during his youth. Yet, as Ban of Bosnia, he was very cordial toward the Bosnian Church. His friendliness to the Bosnian Church suggests he saw it just as another Christian community, not opposed to his own Orthodox faith. Stjepan dramatically expanded Bosnia's territory in all directions. West into parts of today's Croatia, north into the Sava Valley, and south into Hum. Many of these acquired regions were inhabited by Roman Catholics, specifically in the west and north, or Eastern Orthodox in Hum. Stjepan did not attempt to convert these new subjects to the Bosnian Church, nor did he force his Bosnian Church followers to convert to Catholicism. In other words, no religious persecutions or mass conversions accompanied Bosnia's expansion. The Bosnian Church itself remained strongest in the core of Bosnia, without spreading into the newly annexed lands. This religious tolerance and status quo policy speak to Stjepan's priorities. Maintaining stability and loyalty was more important than enforcing religious uniformity. It also reinforces that the Bosnian Church was not a proselytizing sect. It largely served its existing communities and did not seek to expand. In this period, we see the first recorded mention of the term Bosnian Church. Sometime between 1322 and 1325, Ban Stjepan issued a charter at the monastery at Moštre near Visoko that explicitly names the Bosnian Church and its hierarchy. In this document, the titles of Djed, Gost, and Starac are referenced, confirming the organized structure of the Church. This charter opens with the invocation of the Trinity, in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Ghost. This is an important detail. It reaffirms belief in the Trinity, which genuine Bogomil dualists would reject. Thus, the Bosnian Church in Stjepan's time clearly professed the basic tenets of Christianity like any Orthodox or Catholic community. Later in our story, we will see more evidence of Bosnian Christians venerating the cross and Jesus, further disproving the idea that they were heretics. While internally Bosnia enjoyed religious peace, externally the papacy in Hungary had not given up their concern about heresy. Papal letters continued to arrive, urging actions against Bosnian heretics. In 1325, Pope John XXII wrote both Ban Stjepan and the King of Hungary, reminding them of their duty to uproot heresy. The Pope claimed that many heretics from various regions were flocking to Bosnia. It's worth noting, however, that these allegations were not corroborated by any other evidence. We have no records of masses of foreign heretics in Bosnia beyond the papal accusations. If a few straggling dualists did seek refuge in Bosnia, they must have been insignificant in number and impact. Nevertheless, through the 1330s, popes kept pressuring local leaders about Bosnia's religious conformity. One new tactic by Rome was to enlist the Franciscan order to work in Bosnia. The Franciscans, a missionary order, were tasked in the 1330s with converting the Bosnian heretics and schismatics back to Catholicism. In 1337, Pope Benedict XII even wrote to the noble leaders of neighboring Catholic lands like Croatia, urging them to assist the Franciscans, lamenting that the friars had made little headway because Ban Stjepan and other Bosnian nobles protected and favored the heretics. However, we have no solid evidence that any Franciscan friars were actually operating in Bosnia at the time. The Pope's remarks might indicate attempts were made, but possibly thwarted. When a small crusading force was raised in the late 1330s to enter Bosnia, Stjepan acted decisively to stop it. He sent Bosnian troops to the Dalmatian coast and preemptively struck at the town of Trogir, preventing any invasion of Bosnia. In a surprising twist, Stjepan had the backing of the King of Hungary in this move. The Hungarian king warned that anyone who attacked Bosnia would be considered unfaithful to the Hungarian crown. This shows that at least for a period, Bosnia and Hungary enjoyed a political alliance, and Hungary was more interested in good relations with Stjepan than indulging papal crusades. Bosnia's geopolitical importance against other threats like the rising Serbian kingdom or Venice may have made Hungary hold off on destabilizing it further. By 1340, Stjepan normalized the relationship with the papacy. He reopened Bosnia to the Franciscans, allowing them to enter his realm and preach freely. The Franciscans began establishing churches and monasteries and converting segments of the populace to Catholicism. Around this same time, perhaps as part of the reconciliation, Stjepan himself converted to Catholicism. If so, this conversion seems to have been politically motivated and did not alter his tolerant stance towards the Bosnian Church. The Franciscan sources note that their missionary activity was concentrated in central Bosnia, areas around Visoko and the mining town of Olovo, while much of the country still saw little Catholic presence in this period. A majority of Franciscans sent were Italian friars who spoke no Slavic, which limited their effectiveness with the local peasantry. Stjepan even wrote to the Pope, pleading for Franciscans who knew or would learn the Slavic language, because there was a dire shortage of clergy in Bosnia able to administer to the people. This tells us that even as Catholic influence grew, the language barrier kept many Bosnians attached to their own church, which used Slavic in liturgy. A notable figure emerges in this era, Peregrin Saxon, the head of the Franciscan mission. By Stjepan's insistence, Peregrin was appointed Catholic Bishop of Bosnia in 1349, and crucially, he took up residence in the country. This was the first time in over a century that a bishop of Bosnia actually lived inside the country's borders. However, Bishop Peregrin died in 1355, and afterwards the Catholic Church once again assigned the bishopric to foreigners in Đakovo. The removal of the bishopric from Bosnia rekindled tensions. Stjepan passed away in 1353, but his successor would soon face the familiar accusations. Stjepan was succeeded by his 15-year-old nephew, Tvrtko Kotromanić, who eventually became the first king of Bosnia. In Tvrtko's early reign, Bosnia went through both internal strife and external challenges. The Catholic clergy based in Đakovo resumed their old tricks of proclaiming heresy in Bosnia to undermine the ruler's authority. In 1360, Pope Innocent VI wrote to the Bosnian bishop in Đakovo, giving him permission to use force against the heretics, effectively authorizing another crusade. By 1363, open war erupted. King Louis of Hungary launched a two-pronged invasion of Bosnia from the north. The Bosnian nobility was split. Some sided with the Hungarian king, while others stayed loyal to the young Ban. Despite the odds, Tvrtko's forces miraculously repelled both waves of the Hungarian attack. The failure of the 1363 crusade solidified Bosnia's resilience and Tvrtko's standing. In 1369, Pope Urban V wrote to the archbishops of Split and Dubrovnik complaining that many heretics in Bosnia were not far from their lands and even coming into Dalmatia to spread heresy. He ordered them to bar heretics from crossing into Dalmatia and to halt trade with Bosnia. This decree, however, was largely ignored, especially by Dubrovnik, because Dalmatian economies depended heavily on trade with Bosnia. Dubrovnik was not about to sacrifice its commerce over papal fears. The Pope's letter indicates continued concern, but the lack of enforcement shows that the regional players had grown accustomed to tolerating or shrugging off Bosnia's religious peculiarity for the sake of commerce and politics. In the late 1360s and 70s, Tvrtko emerged as a formidable ruler. He expanded Bosnia further and even claimed the Serbian throne through family ties. In 1377, Tvrtko crowned himself King of Raška and Bosnia, symbolically uniting parts of both realms. Interestingly, he was crowned at the Orthodox monastery of Mileševa by an Orthodox metropolitan. A metropolitan is analogous to a Catholic bishop. This was a political move leveraging his legacy, as he was the great-grandson of the Serbian king Stefan Dragutin. It underscores how fluid religious affiliations were at the state level. A Bosnian ruler with a Catholic upbringing could take a crown in an Orthodox ceremony for political legitimacy. Yet, Tvrtko did not abandon Catholicism entirely. Records show he attended Catholic Mass regularly and was considered a Catholic monarch by Western contemporaries. Despite being a practicing Catholic, Tvrtko remained tolerant of the Bosnian Church. According to reports sent to Rome, Tvrtko allowed heretics to participate alongside him in Catholic services. Members of the Bosnian Church were at his court, and he didn't consider them heretical to be excluded from Mass. As a Catholic king, he still protected and even promoted Bosnian Church clergy. They continued to serve in his administration. Bosnian Djeds were often witnesses to royal charters, envoys, and mediators in diplomatic affairs. The church thrived and grew during his reign, enjoying royal protection. By the end of Tvrtko's life, Bosnia had reached its zenith, and the Bosnian Church was still standing. In 1389, Tvrtko sent Bosnian soldiers to fight at the Battle of Kosovo Polje against the Ottoman Turks. After that bloody stalemate, when the Serbian Prince Lazar and the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed were killed, Tvrtko proclaimed victory and even sent letters to Italy announcing that Bosnia and its allies had saved Christendom. The Florentines hailed King Tvrtko as a savior of Christianity for a time. This is quite ironic considering the Pope's long suspicion of Bosnia's Christianity. It shows that at least for a moment, Bosnia's political alignment with Christendom overshadowed questions of heresy. Tvrtko died in 1391. He is considered one of the greatest medieval rulers of Bosnia and left behind a country that was larger and politically stronger. After King Tvrtko's death, Bosnia went through a series of shorter reigns and dynastic struggles. Despite the turbulence, the Bosnian Church remained active, though its influence may have been waning. King Tvrtko's successors included King Dabisha, who reigned from 1391 to 1395, and then his widow Jelena, who ruled until 1398, followed by King Stjepan Ostoja and others. We have limited evidence of these rulers' personal faith. The consensus was that they were Catholics, except for Ostoja, who was a member of the Bosnian Church. What is clear is that the Bosnian Church continued to function at the royal court. Its leaders often appear as witnesses or guarantors on royal documents and mediators in peacemaking agreements. They were trusted figures in Bosnian diplomatic and legal affairs, showing that even Bosnian kings who were Catholic valued the Bosnian Church's role in society. However, the situation began to shift. By the early 1400s, the Franciscan missionaries' efforts were yielding greater results. They established monasteries throughout central Bosnia and started converting increasing numbers of people to Catholicism. They focused not only on commoners, but also sought to influence the noble families. Many children of Bosnian nobles who had traditionally belonged to the Bosnian Church were now being baptized and raised as Catholics, but many of them did not completely sever ties with the old Church. Around this time, the Hungarians themselves softened their terminology for Bosnian Christians. They shifted from calling them heretics to calling them schismatics, meaning simply separated from Rome. This change suggests that by the 15th century, even Bosnia's critics recognized that the Bosnian Church followers were Christian in doctrine, just not subordinated to the Pope. One of the Bosnian kings of this era, Tvrtko II, provides an example of the complexities of faith. When he sought to marry a Catholic noblewoman around 1428, Rome doubted whether he was truly Catholic. Tvrtko responded by writing to the Pope, acknowledging that his land was full of schismatics, but asserting that he personally was a good Catholic. The Pope accepted this and allowed the marriage. But Tvrtko continued to maintain a good relationship with the Bosnian Church's leadership. Dubrovnik at one point even implored the Djed of the Bosnian Church to intervene with the king on their behalf, which he did. This shows that the Djed still had the ear of the king in the 1420s, acting as a mediator. The final blow to the church came with the final generation of the Bosnian kingdom, under King Stjepan Tomaš and King Stjepan Tomašević. These events unfolded against the backdrop of the Ottoman advance into the Balkans, which by the mid-15th century threatened Bosnia directly. In the 1440s, Stjepan Tomaš, most likely an illegitimate son of King Ostoja, vied for the throne. Bosnia was divided by civil conflict. Tomaš, backed by the Pope in Hungary, versus the powerful lord in Hum, Stjepan Vukčić Kosača, who refused to recognize him. This power struggle had a religious dimension. Vukčić, who called himself Herceg of Hum, from which Herzegovina gets its name, supported Tomaš's brother Radivoj. When Tomaš eventually prevailed, he made a strategic choice. Although he had likely been a Bosnian Church adherent earlier in his life, Tomaš officially converted to Catholicism to gain the papal and Hungarian approval for his kingship. He also married Katarina Kosača, the Herceg's daughter, as a part of a peace deal. Even after converting, King Tomasz did not immediately turn on the Bosnian Church. In fact, a royal charter from 1446 shows him granting land with a djed as a guarantor. Soon after, though, papal pressure forced Tomasz to take a harder stance. The Herceg Vukčić rebelled again and allied with the Ottomans and the Serbians, while King Tomasz remained aligned with Rome and Hungary. In 1453, a peace treaty in the region of Hum was brokered with the involvement of the Bosnian Church. It was sanctioned by the djed, indicating that the Bosnian Church hierarchy had now moved into Herzegovina to escape Tomasz's Catholic court. Meanwhile, King Tomasz, under papal influence, started an internal campaign to suppress the Bosnian Church in central Bosnia. By around 1460, he stepped up the persecution of the Bosnian Church clergy. One source states that about 2,000 members of the church were converted to Catholicism by force, and 40 of the highest clergy fled to Herzegovina, under the protection of Vukčić. This was effectively the final crackdown on the Bosnian Church as an institution in Bosnia proper. The church still survived in Vukčić's lands a little while longer. A 1450s peace treaty from Dubrovnik sheds more light on the beliefs of that church. The charter begins with a cross and an invocation of the Trinity, and speaks of God sending his only Son Jesus for the salvation of mankind. These lines echo mainstream Christian belief in the crucifixion and resurrection. The significance is huge. It demonstrates that the Bosnian Church's theology was essentially the same as Catholic and Orthodox Christianity on core points. It explicitly contradicts dualist Bogomil teachings. For instance, Bogomils believed God had two sons, Jesus and Satan, and rejected the physical cross and many Old Testament teachings. But the Bosnian Church, as reflected in this document, honored the cross, embraced the Trinity, and accepted Jesus as the only Son of God. By the 1460s, Bosnia's religious landscape had drastically changed. Thanks to King Tomasz's efforts and decades of Franciscan preaching, the majority of Bosnians were now Catholic. The Bosnian Church's followers had dwindled to a small number, likely concentrated in the Herceg's lands, and perhaps remote pockets of the interior. The Orthodox presence in Bosnia was also relatively small, limited to the eastern border regions by the Drina River and parts of inner Herzegovina. However, tensions between Catholic and Orthodox factions, especially along the southern borders near Herceg's territory and the Dalmatian coast, were growing as these two churches started vying for influence. All of this was overshadowed by the looming Ottoman threat. By 1459, the Ottomans had conquered neighboring Serbia, posing an existential threat to Bosnia. The Pope in Rome urged King Tomasz to ally with his enemy, the Herceg, to form a united front against the Turks. Tomasz was hesitant. He dragged his feet, officially blaming the religious unorthodoxy of the Herceg's land as an excuse not to fully cooperate. The deeper reason was strategic. Tomasz likely realized that Bosnia alone could not withstand the Ottoman army, and he was unwilling to commit to war unless Western powers sent substantial military aid, which they did not. Also, many Bosnian nobles were calculating that Ottoman domination might be preferable to that of Hungary. They had some experience with them and thought that they might retain local power under the tolerant Ottomans rather than lose everything to Catholic crusaders. Seeing the writing on the wall, an observer noted that some Bosnians preferred the Turks over the Hungarians. In the midst of these divisions, King Tomasz died in July 1461, leaving the throne to his son Stjepan Tomašević. The young king, only in his early 20s, had been raised Catholic from childhood. he received a crown from the Pope and was crowned in the city of Jajce in November 1461. His reign was short-lived. In 1463, the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II decided to conquer Bosnia outright. The Ottoman forces swept into Bosnia with overwhelming force. King Tomašević fled his capital but was eventually captured in the northern fortress of Ključ. The Ottomans promised him freedom if he ordered the remaining garrisons to surrender, which he did. They then broke their promise and executed him. With his death, the Kotromanić dynasty came to a brutal end, and Bosnia lost its independence. The fall of the Bosnian kingdom was rapid. Most of the country was overrun by the Ottomans in 1463, with only pockets of resistance. Hungary did launch a counter-offensive, briefly recapturing some northern regions, and the Herceg held out in parts of Herzegovina until the late 1460s, but these were only temporary wins. In the aftermath, Rome and Hungary sought to put the blame on someone for this loss. One convenient scapegoat was the Bosnian Church. Later legends and some Hungarian propaganda of the time accused the Church of betraying the kingdom to the Turks, suggesting that the heretics actively colluded with the Ottomans and led to Bosnia's downfall. It's true that the members of the Bosnian Church, having been persecuted by the Catholic authorities, might not have been motivated to defend King Tomašević's regime. Some may have welcomed the Ottomans as liberators from Hungarian and papal pressure. However, blaming the Bosnian Church for the Turkish conquest is largely unfounded. Surviving diplomatic letters between the Pope, Hungary, Dubrovnik, Venice, and others in the months around the invasion show no concern about any internal treachery by the Bosnians. The kingdom fell due to overwhelming force and a lack of external help, not because of an elaborate conspiracy. The story of the Bosnian Church inviting the Turks appears to be a later myth, a way for Hungary, which had failed to rescue Bosnia, to deflect blame onto the heretics, and for some Catholic chroniclers to moralize that Bosnia was punished for tolerating heresy. In reality, there is minimal evidence of organized cooperation between the Bosnian Church and the Ottomans, although it's plausible that some disgruntled Bosnians perceive the Ottomans as a less harmful force. With the Ottoman victory, the Bosnian Church ceased to exist as an organization. Immediately after the conquest, the Franciscan friars obtained an official charter from Sultan Mehmed II, guaranteeing the Catholics freedom to practice their faith in Bosnia. The Franciscans had the backing of the Vatican and foreign powers, so the Ottomans, being pragmatic about administration, granted these capitulations. The Bosnian Church, however, made no such petition. By 1463, its leadership was decimated. Many clergy had fled or been forced to convert in the years prior. The church had never been a tightly organized populist church of the masses. Now, with its protectors gone and no foreign patron to speak for it, it simply evaporated. Probably by 1470, the Bosnian Church was effectively extinct, its remaining adherents having assimilated into Islam, Catholicism, or even the Orthodox Church in the ensuing decades. Within a generation, the religious map of Bosnia was transformed. The Ottomans favored the Orthodox Church, since the Orthodox Patriarch now resided in Ottoman territory and was loyal to the Sultan, while they viewed the Catholic ties to Rome with suspicion. Many Bosnian nobles and commoners who had been part of the Bosnian Church chose to convert to Islam under the Ottoman rule. The weak hold of any church and the peasantry made these conversions relatively swift. Meanwhile, Orthodox Christians from the east migrated into Bosnia under Ottoman encouragement, repopulating regions and eventually becoming the main Christian presence by the 16th and 17th centuries. the Bosnian Church vanished so completely that for centuries afterward, its story survived only in outsider accounts and folklore. To conclude, the Bosnian Church was most likely a monastic offshoot of Catholicism, born out of Bosnia's unique circumstances of political autonomy and religious isolation. Far from being a deviant dualist cult, it appears to have shared the core beliefs of the universal Christian faith: belief in one God, the Trinity, Jesus Christ's redemptive role, and the authority of Scripture. Where it differed was in organization and ritual language. The Bosnian Church conducted liturgy in the local Slavic language rather than Latin, and it had no allegiance to the Pope. Its clergy led a celibate life, much like Catholic monks, but without a bishop appointed by Rome. It was not a missionary church. It did not actively seek to convert others. This lack of evangelizing, combined with the generally loose religiosity of the Bosnian populace, meant that its influence remained limited. The common people of Bosnia were only loosely attached to any church, be it Catholic, Orthodox, or Bosnian, and were quick to adopt outward elements of a new faith when circumstances changed. In that sense, the Bosnian Church's overall impact on spirituality in Bosnia was modest, compared to the deep roots that Roman Catholicism had in Croatia or Orthodoxy in Serbia. However, the Bosnian Church's historical significance is considerable. For over 200 years, it provided Bosnia with a kind of third way, a native religious identity that was neither Roman Catholic nor Eastern Orthodox. This helped Bosnia maintain its political independence, as neither Rome nor Constantinople could claim full authority there. The Church's existence gave foreign powers like Hungary a consistent excuse to intervene, but it also meant neither the Catholic nor Orthodox Church ever achieved absolute dominance in the country. The multi-confessional character of medieval Bosnia, with a Catholic king and Orthodox, Catholic, and Bosnian Church subjects, was unusual in this age. In the end, the Church was not responsible for the Islamization of Bosnia. Rather, it was the weak, decentralized state of all churches that left many Bosnians with shallow roots in any one faith, making conversion to Islam under Ottoman rule relatively easy. The Bosnian Church stands as a fascinating chapter in the history of Bosnia and Herzegovina, a homegrown Christian community shaped by the rugged, pluralistic world of the medieval Balkans. Its rise and fall illustrate how religion, politics, and culture intertwined in Bosnian history. And its legacy, the idea of Bosnia as a meeting point of different faiths, endured, setting the stage for Bosnia's identity in the centuries to come. Thank you for listening to the History of Bosnia and Herzegovina podcast. In the next episode, we'll continue the story of Bosnia in the medieval ages. In the meantime, if you have questions or comments, feel free to reach me by visiting historyofbosnia.com or through social media. The links are in the show notes. Until next time, take care, and I'll talk to you soon.